They said the frontier was no place for a single woman. But Eleanora Nora McAllister never took kindly to what people said. She lived by her own core on the wind-swept plains, tending a small ranch long after her husband fell to a stray bullet in the cattle wars. Yet nothing in her rugged existence prepared her for the day she discovered a lost Cheyenne child, alone on the dusty trail. In that moment, her life changed forever. 7 days later at dawn, 50 silent warriors arrived, shadows cutting across the horizon. What they wanted, no one in Sweetwater County could possibly guess. Eleanora Nora McAllister had an unbreakable spirit, the kind that seemed at odds with her gentle features and slender frame. She first came to Sweetwater County from Missouri with her husband Jamie McAllister in the spring of 1875. Back then, the rolling plains promised a life of quiet independence and the hope of a fresh start. They settled on a 160-acre parcel near the dusty frontier town of Kincaid's Crossing, a place known for its saloon, a modest church, and a row of small shops that fought daily against the elements and the unpredictability of the frontier. Jamie's death came quickly and brutally, just 2 years later. Caught in the crossfire of a dispute between rival cattlemen men who believed that wire fences had no place on the open range, he was one of 3 unfortunate bystanders shot by a drunken cowboy named Delbert Wyatt. Wyatt had never meant to kill Jamie, or so he wept before a cold-faced marshal led him away. And yet the tragedy was done. Nora remained fueled by a fierce independence. She was determined to carve out a life from the unforgiving land she had grown to love and hate in equal measure. Each dawn found her saddling up the old chestnut mare, Prairie Belle, to ride the perimeter of her property. There were barbed wire fences to mend a small herd of cattle, to check on vegetable patches to weed, and a lone orchard of pecan trees to tend. It was on one such ride that Nora came upon the child. The boy couldn't have been older than 7 or 8. His dark hair hung in 2 messy braids, and he clutched a tattered blanket decorated with geometric patterns Nora recognized as Cheyenne. A gash ran across his forehead, caked with dried blood. His dark eyes, wide with pain and fear, locked on Nora. For a heartbeat, they stared at each other without speaking. Nora slowly dismounted and approached with caution. The boy flinched but did not run. She glanced around, scanning the horizon for any sign of who he belonged to. No footprints, no scattered belongings, no horse. Just the child alone. She knelt beside him. "Hey there, son," she whispered, reaching out a careful hand. He recoiled at first, clearly terrified. But Nora's voice carried a gentle reassurance, an undertone of compassion the boy seemed to sense. Slowly, he allowed her to touch his forehead. She traced the wound gently, feeling his shudder under her calloused fingers. With her free hand, she rummaged through her saddlebag for a canteen of water. She offered it to him, and he grabbed it with trembling hands, swallowing in desperate gulps. It was a sight that wrenched Nora's heart. What could have happened to leave him like this all alone on the open prairie? She tried speaking to him in the few Cheyenne words she had picked up over the years of living near native communities. Her pronunciation was clumsy, but she managed a simple greeting. The child's eyes shifted a flicker of recognition in them. He spoke softly words that Nora couldn't fully understand. Still, it was enough to show her he was indeed a Cheyenne boy, lost and probably injured. Nora looked around again. If the child was here alone, something must have happened. Perhaps his family was nearby searching for him. Maybe they'd been attacked, or he'd been abandoned. The possibilities worried her. Gently she lifted him onto Prairie Belle. The boy winced when she touched him, but he didn't protest. She climbed up behind him, holding him steady. Taking a last look at the empty horizon, she clicked her tongue and spurred the horse towards home. It was the beginning of an extraordinary week, one that would change Nora's life forever, bringing challenges she never imagined and forging a bond that would reverberate across the plains. Kincaid's Crossing. A dusty frontier settlement had a single street lined with clapboard buildings, a narrow boardwalk on either side to keep citizens out of the mud during spring rains and the clang of the blacksmith's hammer that echoed in the early morning hours. Over time, Nora had grown accustomed to ignoring the ever-watchful eyes of townspeople whenever she came in for supplies. A widow living alone was still a curiosity. But 2 days after finding the Cheyenne child, Nora ventured into town with a new wariness. She needed bandages ointment for the boy's wound, and something that might tempt his appetite more than her usual fare of beans and salted pork. Over her years on the frontier, she had learned which local shops carried the best selection of fruit preserves and fresh bread. She took the child with her, mostly to keep an eye on him and protect him from prying eyes out at the ranch. The boy, who had quietly offered the name Tsekitsi, clung to her side. Though he was beginning to regain his strength, each step seemed to ache in his thin legs, and anxiety shimmered in his dark eyes. They arrived at Harriet's general store by late morning. Harriet Osborne, a plump woman with kind eyes, greeted Nora with a nod, but her gaze drifted uncertainly to the boy. Word spread fast in small towns, and Harriet had heard plenty of rumors. Some folks said a band of Cheyenne had wandered too close to the ranches. Others whispered about Indian raids up north near the Smoky Hill River. Harriet forced a smile. "Morning, Nora," she said, wiping her hands on her apron. "Got your usual order ready in the back. That boy doing all right?" Nora gave a polite nod. "He's fine. Might need some extra salve for his cut. You still carry that rosehip ointment?" Harriet clucked her tongue sympathetically. "I do. Let me fetch it." While Harriet disappeared into the back, Nora guided Tsekitsi around the small shop. He gazed in wonder at the glass jars of penny candy, the sacks of flour stacked higher than his head, and the shelves of bright tin cookware. She handed him a peppermint stick. He popped it in his mouth, and though he tried to look stoic, his eyes sparkled for a moment. The hush that fell over the store signaled the arrival of someone else. Nora turned to see Jeremiah Grady, a rancher from the next county over, stepping inside. He was a burly man with a handlebar mustache that bristled whenever he frowned, which was almost always. He spotted Nora and the Cheyenne boy, and his lips pressed into a tight line. "Mornin', Nora," he said stiffly, then nodded at Tsekitsi. "Heard tell you was harboring an Indian child." Nora's spine stiffened. "Just picking up supplies, Jeremiah." Harriet returned with the ointment, setting it on the counter. Grady advanced a step, overshadowing the child. "You best be careful, Nora. I heard about a band of Cheyenne that's been roaming around. Might be them that's been rustling cattle. If they find their kid here." His meaning hung in the air like a bad smell. Harriet tried to smooth over the tension. "Now, Jeremiah, let's not jump to conclusions. No one has proven any of that. And certainly we've had rustlers before who were nothing but white men in stolen boots." Grady's gaze was hard. "You'll do what you like, Nora, but the law's the law. If the army gets wind there's a Cheyenne boy living out on your property, they might come asking questions, and I'd bet they won't be so gentle about it." Nora's blood simmered, but she held her tongue. She scooped up her purchases, paid Harriet, and ushered the boy out. Before the door closed behind her, she heard Grady mutter, "She'll regret this, mark my words." Outside, the sun beat down mercilessly. The boy looked shaken, clinging to Nora's hand. She patted his shoulder reassuringly, though a stone of dread had lodged in her belly. She knew that protecting Sekitsi would come at a cost, but she'd made her choice. Back at the ranch, Nora set to work. She bathed Sekitsi's wound with warm water and herbal soap, applied the rosehip ointment, and wrapped it in clean bandages. His cheeks had regained some color, and he was eating with greater enthusiasm. She baked cornbread and allowed him to smear it with butter and honey, though it took him a few tries to adapt to the taste. As the sun sank below the horizon, Nora showed him how to feed the chickens. She pointed at herself and said, "Nora," then pointed at him. He repeated his name quietly, letting the last syllable linger. Sekitsi. She attempted to sound out the syllables, hoping she was getting them right. The boy smiled shyly at first. Little by little they established communication through gestures, halting phrases and expressions. Each day she learned more. He spoke of his mother-father and a younger sister. From what Nora pieced together, they'd been traveling with a small group when they were attacked. He didn't say by whom. The boy had fled in confusion, eventually collapsing from his injury, hunger and thirst. He didn't know if his family was still alive or had been captured by the attackers. Nora's heart ached for him. It brought back memories of losing her own family. Her parents had died of fever when she was 14, and her husband's loss was still a recent wound that bled sorrow on lonely nights. A quiet kinship grew between them, woven from their shared tragedies, but a looming worry gnawed at the back of her mind. What if Sekitsi's people came looking for him? Or worse, what if the army discovered him here, seeing it as a cause for trouble? The tension between settlers and native tribes had escalated in the region. She recalled news from Harriet about the U.S. cavalry out of Fort Riley being dispatched west on more than one occasion to quell rumored Indian unrest. One afternoon, as they sat by the fireplace, she pulled out a dusty stack of old books and a few tinted photographs. One photo showed her husband, Jamie, proud and tall, hugging her from behind. Sekitsi studied the image with curiosity. Nora tried to explain who Jamie was using gestures and soft words. The boy nodded, understanding that the man was important to her and that he was gone. He reached out a small hand and patted her shoulder, a gentle attempt at comfort. That evening, a rider approached. Through the living room window, Nora spotted a lantern bobbing along the lane, accompanied by the silhouette of a man on horseback. She quickly guided Sekitsi to her bedroom and told him to stay quiet. Nora opened the door. It was the local deputy, Calvin Booker, who was only a few years older than she. He had a reputation as a fair man, though newly on the job. His face was drawn. "Evening, Nora," he said, tilting his hat. "Marshal Brackett sent me around. Mind if I come in?" She forced a polite smile. "Come on in, Calvin. It's a bit late for a social visit, though." He stepped inside, glancing around in that lawman's way that suggested he was cataloguing her entire living room. "Didn't come for a chat, I'm afraid. Word around town is you've been looking after a young Indian boy. Any truth to that?" Nora's heart hammered, but she kept her features calm. "You hear a lot of rumors in a place like Kincaid's. Doesn't make them all true." He sighed. "Nora, you've always been an honest woman. I don't want to stir trouble for you, but if there's a child from a local tribe here, The marshal wants to know. There have been complaints about missing livestock. Some folks claim it's Indian rustlers. Don't ask me if it's true, but people are on edge. The Cheyenne around these parts have been pushed off their lands before, and it's gotten violent. If you're sheltering someone—" She folded her arms. "It's nonsense, Calvin. If there are rustlers, they're more likely from the same no-account thieves we've seen for years. Blaming Indians is just easy for folks who hate them." He was quiet for a moment, considering her words. Then he nodded. "Marshal Brackett might come calling himself just to be sure. If you know anything, you'd best be careful." She nodded, and he took his leave. Through the window, she watched him ride off into the night, the flicker of his lantern growing smaller until it disappeared. Nora locked the door and returned to the bedroom. Tsukitsi sat on the floor, arms wrapped around his knees, eyes wide with fear. She knelt beside him and promised in a soothing voice to keep him safe. The boy reached out and clutched her hand. Nora silently vowed to protect him, come what may. Trouble in the West often started with a rumor, grew into a fear, and exploded into violence. By the fourth day after Nora found Tsukitsi, tension in Sweetwater County was palpable. Ranchers gathered at Kincaid's saloon in the evenings, swapping stories about phantom footprints in the dust near their herds, or glimpses of riders with braided hair and buckskins spotted on the horizon. In every version, the Cheyenne were lurking, waiting to strike. At Harriet's general store, talk of a possible militia forming circulated. Men like Jeremiah Grady, emboldened by the fear, saw it as an opportunity to drive out any native presence for good. Others tried to temper the discussion, but hysteria is a stubborn thing once it takes root. Nora kept to her ranch, focusing on the daily tasks, yet the hairs on the back of her neck stood on end every time she glimpsed a rider or a dust cloud rising on the trail. She took to hiding Tsukitsi in the barn loft when any visitor came. She taught him how to climb up and stay hidden among the hay bales. At night, she listened for sounds of hoofbeats. She slept fitfully, a rifle leaning against her bed. The boy, sensing her anxiety, slept curled on the floor beside her bed, as though wanting to be near someone who offered him protection. On the fifth day, a wagon rattled down her driveway. Nora peered out to see Harriet Osborne. Though surprised by the visit, she welcomed Harriet's warm smile. Harriet brought a small hamper of supplies: flour, sugar, dried fruit, a new spool of thread. They sat in the kitchen sipping tea while Harriet glanced around. "You know, Nora, people in town are itching for trouble," Harriet said, her voice low. "Marshal Brackett is trying to keep order, but folks like Jeremiah Grady have a loud voice. They're starting to say the Cheyenne kidnapped some rancher's child up in Clay County. Whether it's true or not, I don't know." Nora exhaled sharply. "It usually isn't, but hysteria makes men do foolish things." Harriet hesitated, then leaned forward. "I ain't come here just for tea. I want you to know I support you whatever's going on. I don't believe for a second that you're out to cause trouble. But watch your back, dear. People like Grady, they're not going to let this rest." Moved by Harriet's loyalty, Nora placed her hand over Harriet's. "Thank you. I appreciate your kindness more than you know." Harriet's gaze roamed the house. "Is the boy all right?" Nora nodded. "He's fine. Recovering. I don't rightly know what to do next. My heart says to protect him until I find his family, but my head worries about the consequences." "Your heart's always been bigger than this county," Nora Harriet said, with a reassuring smile. "Just stay safe, and if you need help, send word." After Harriet left, Nora sat alone in her quiet kitchen, thinking about her next move. Would she try to find Tsakitsi's people? Could she leave the ranch unattended, risking vandalism or a search while she was gone? The questions stacked like tumbling logs in her mind, each more pressing than the last. She was about to tidy up the dishes when she heard Tsakitsi's soft footsteps. He emerged from his hiding spot in the barn, came into the house, and sat opposite her at the small table. He reached out, took a piece of dried apple, and ate it quietly. "I will help you find your family," Nora said, speaking as though he could understand her every word. "I promised Tsakitsi." He looked at her brow furrowed. She repeated the gesture of searching, miming, looking around, then pointed at him and then at some imaginary group in the distance. The boy seemed to understand, his eyes lit up with hope, then flickered with apprehension. She gave him a soft smile. "We'll do it together," she said. On the 6th day after Tsakitsi arrived at her doorstep, a storm rolled across Sweetwater County like an omen. Dark clouds gathered in the western sky, towering and thick their bellies, a bruised purple. The wind came first, sharp, urgent gusts that rattled the shutters and whipped the trees into a frenzy. Then the temperature dropped, sudden and bone-deep, as if the very land was bracing itself for what was to come. Nora McAllister stood on her porch with one hand braced against a support beam, scanning the horizon. She'd weathered many storms alone since Jamie's death, but this one felt different, not just in strength but in timing. A storm like this on a week already stretched thin with tension and fear was more than just weather. It felt like a warning. "Come on," she muttered under her breath and turned back inside. Tsakitsi was seated at the small kitchen table, carefully peeling the husk off a dried ear of corn. He looked up, his young face tinged with unease as the wind howled louder outside. Nora gave him a gentle smile. "We'd best get everything tied down," she said, softly, motioning toward the barn. The boy stood without protest, slipping on the worn boots she had lent him. They worked in tandem. Nora securing the chicken coop, Tsakitsi collecting scattered tools from the yard. The storm had not yet begun, but the wind was enough to toss loose items and tangle rope lines. By the time they had finished, the sky had gone fully grey. Thunder growled in the distance, deep and long, like some massive creature waking from a bitter sleep. They made it inside just before the first drops hit fat and cold, smacking against the windows in quick succession. For hours the storm pounded the ranch. Rain sheeted down, turning the yard into mud. Lightning slashed the sky like knives, and thunder rolled hard enough to rattle dishes on the shelves. The power of nature was absolute and humbling. Yet inside, there was a strange sense of comfort. Nora lit the fire and made a pot of tea. Tsakitsi huddled in a wool blanket near the hearth, eyes flickering toward the window at every lightning flash. He didn't speak, but she could tell he had seen storms before. Maybe worse. But fear still found a home in a child's heart, no matter how much they'd endured. She joined him on the floor with 2 chipped mugs and handed one to him. "It'll pass," she said, sipping hers. "They always do." He stared into the flames, nodding. They passed the time in quiet companionship. Nora read aloud from a tattered novel, something about a runaway sailor and a hidden island. And though Tsakitsi probably didn't understand the words, he seemed comforted by the sound of her voice. When the wind finally died down after midnight, Nora tucked him in and sat by the fire a while longer, watching the coals burn down to orange embers. The calm was unnerving, and it didn't last. Dawn broke with a fresh sky, bright and deceptively peaceful. The fields glistened with moisture, and steam curled upward from the earth as the sun kissed the wet ground. Nora rose early to milk her lone cow. Her boots squelched through the mud, and every step reminded her that the land, like the people on it, was still recovering from a night of fury. She had just finished feeding the chickens when a sharp sound cut through the air. Crack! A gunshot. She froze. Another shot rang out closer this time. Heart racing, Nora dropped the bucket and bolted for the house. She found Tsakitsi already by the door, eyes wide. She grabbed her rifle from the mantel and motioned him back. Inside, she commanded, "Now." He obeyed without hesitation. Nora stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand. The storm had softened the ground, so the footsteps were easy to spot. She followed them around the side of the barn, boots sinking into fresh mud with every step. She caught sight of them near the orchard, Jeremiah Grady, and a second man, taller and wiry, with a battered hat pulled low. Both had rifles slung casually but close enough to draw. They were trespassing. Grady looked up, smiling like a fox. "Morning, Nora," he called. "Didn't mean to startle you. You fired a gun on my land." She snapped, voice cold. "That's more than a startle." He gestured toward the orchard. "Saw a deer, thought I'd take a shot. Didn't know we were this close to your property line." "You damn well did," she said, raising the rifle halfway. The other man chuckled. "Easy now. I want both of you off my land. Now." Grady held up his hands in mock surrender. "We were just passing through, making sure your property was secure. After all, some folks say you're housing someone who might attract attention." Her finger twitched on the trigger. "There's no one here but me," she lied. "Is that so?" Grady smirked. "'Cause rumor has it there's a Cheyenne boy hiding out in that cabin of yours. And if that's true, well, there are folks who won't be so understanding." "I said leave," she repeated, stepping forward. Her rifle now pointed squarely at Grady's chest. "Or the next sound you hear won't be thunder." The standoff stretched. Finally, Grady gave a low whistle and backed away. "You've got grit, Nora. I'll give you that. But grit don't stop bullets. Just remember Sweetwater's watching, and it doesn't take much for a mob to form." He turned and walked off with his companion. Nora watched them go, only lowering her rifle when their shapes disappeared beyond the ridge. Back inside, Tsakitsi waited by the window. "They're gone," she said quietly. He said nothing, but the relief in his eyes was palpable. That evening, as the sky darkened once more, Nora bolted every door and shutter. She lit candles and cooked what little remained of the fresh bread. They ate in silence. The threat had not passed. It had only shifted. What once was whispered now felt dangerously close to spoken. She tucked the boy into bed again, sitting beside him until his breathing slowed. Outside, the stars blinked through the remnants of storm clouds. Nora stood by the window and whispered into the dark hold on just one more day. Because tomorrow was the 7th day, and something told her that everything was about to change. Sleep came only in fragments that night. Nora lay stiffly in bed, her rifle leaning against the nightstand, her eyes flicking to every shadow that crept along the cabin walls. Outside, the prairie exhaled in hushed murmurs, a world holding its breath. Across the room, Tsakitsi curled on a cot with the blanket pulled tightly to his chin, eyes wide open, staring at nothing. Neither of them spoke. There was little to say. Nora dozed once or twice, but woke each time in a cold sweat. The image of Grady's sneer, or the echo of her own warning shot burned into her skull. She had faced men with guns before. She'd buried a husband because of it. But this time she had stood in front of 50 warriors and 6 hot-headed settlers, and made a choice one she couldn't undo. At some point before dawn, she rose and lit a lamp moving with quiet purpose. She put on her thick coat, laced her boots, and peeked through the curtains. The fog outside was dense, clinging to the land like ghosts. Somewhere out there, she knew someone was watching. Then came the first sound. Not hoofbeats, not gunfire. It was a meadowlark. Soft, solitary. The sound cracked through the silence like morning's first breath. Nora opened the door and stepped outside. The fog hung low across the field, the barn barely visible. She took a few cautious steps onto the porch, cradling the rifle in her arms. The air smelled of wet earth and cooling ash from the fireplace's overnight burn. Behind her, she heard Sakitsi stir. "Come here, sweetheart," she said, softly, not turning around. "You'll want to see this." He padded over on silent feet and peered around her frame. And there, silhouetted by the rising sun, they appeared. Dozens of figures materialized from the mist like phantoms on horseback. Not in motion, not threatening, just standing. Waiting. Quiet as the grass. 50 warriors. They were spaced in a wide arc across the front of Nora's land horses. Still faces, expressionless weapons, holstered. The early sunlight caught the eagle feathers braided into their hair, the leather fringe of their shirts, the painted lines drawn across cheeks. They made no noise, but their presence thundered. Sakitsi whispered one word, "Nestse hesse." Cheyenne. Nora's heart thudded in her chest, but she did not panic. These were not raiders or scouts. They had not come with anger. They had come with purpose. She understood it now. This was not a surprise visit. This was a retrieval. She turned back inside and gathered the boy's things, a small pouch, the tattered remains of his blanket, and a piece of peppermint he had saved. She handed them to him gently. He took them with a trembling hand. "Ready?" she asked softly. He hesitated, then nodded. Together, they stepped off the porch and walked into the clearing. From the Cheyenne line, one rider moved. It was the same warrior from before Nesto, his face stoic, but eyes rich with sorrow and gratitude. He dismounted and approached on foot, his hands open, palms out to show peace. Nora raised her hand in greeting, echoing his motion. The boy stepped slightly ahead of her, looking up at Nesto with a mix of hope and caution. They studied each other. Then slowly, Nesto reached out and touched Sakitsi's shoulder. A brief word passed between them in Cheyenne. The boy nodded. He turned back to Nora, eyes shimmering. "You go with him now," she said, kneeling. "He'll take you home." The boy wrapped his arms around her. She closed her eyes and hugged him fiercely, pressing her cheek to his dark hair, memorizing the warmth of him. "Be brave," she whispered, "and be happy." He pulled away and walked toward Nesto, who helped him onto his horse. The boy sat upright, holding the reins with more certainty than he'd had when he first arrived at her door, bloodied and terrified. Then the rest of the warriors moved. They flowed like river water, silent, steady, gathering behind Nesto, forming a protective wall around the boy. No one raised a weapon. No one spoke aloud. The power in their silence struck Nora harder than any speech could. and just as the last of the mist lifted, they began to ride. Nora stood alone in the middle of her field, arms folded across her chest, watching until the final horse and rider vanished over the distant rise. She turned slowly and walked back to the porch. She sat on the steps and stared at the spot where Sakitsi had stood just days earlier, handing her a wildflower. Now the boy was gone, returned to his people. The silence he left behind rang in her ears like church bells after a funeral. But she didn't cry. Not yet. Because before she could even exhale, another sound came. Hoofbeats, different this time, faster, urgent. Nora's eyes snapped toward the West Trail, and a new group of riders emerged, Jeremiah Grady and his posse, 6 men, wide, armed, and grim. They were too late. Damn it, Grady growled, yanking his horse to a halt. They were here. Nora rose slowly. They're gone. Jeremiah, just as I said they would be. Grady scanned the field, searching for conflict, for reason to draw blood. There was none. No violence, no fire, only hoof prints and fog. You helped them escape, he spat. I helped a child return to his family, she replied coolly. You came looking for a war and missed the moment where peace was chosen instead. One of Grady's men shifted uneasily in his saddle. She's right, boss. There's nothing here. Grady's jaw clenched, but he said nothing more. He pulled his reins sharply and turned. This isn't over, he called over his shoulder. Not by a long shot. Then they thundered off hooves, chewing up the trail. Only once the dust settled did Nora exhale. She leaned back against the porch post, staring at the empty horizon. They had come. They had taken the boy home. And because of one child's safety and one woman's defiance, the world, if only for a moment, had not burned. The sun had barely crested over the horizon when Nora McAllister stood frozen in the space between 2 worlds. To one side, 50 Cheyenne warriors, silent and still, formed a solemn arc in the morning mist. Their painted ponies shifted restlessly, but made no sound, as if trained to honor the gravity of the moment. To the other side, 6 armed white men on horseback, led by Jeremiah Grady, bristled with suspicion and powder-loaded nerves. In the very center of it all stood Nora, rifle in hand, heart drumming a war beat beneath her rib cage. Beside her, Sakitsi clung to her skirt, trembling but unmoving. The boy didn't cry out or run. He simply stared ahead at the Cheyenne warrior who had stepped forward. The man's name, Nora recalled, was Nesto. His eyes locked on Sakitsi with a tenderness that contrasted the harsh lines of his sun-worn face. Then behind them, Grady's bellow shattered the silence. Get away from that woman, you devils! The Cheyenne didn't flinch, but Nora turned, fury snapping through her like a whip crack. She held up one arm toward Grady, the other gripping her rifle tightly. Don't take another step, Jeremiah. They've done nothing wrong. Grady, flanked by his men, scowled. His mustache twitched like a rattlesnake about to strike. They came onto your land, armed and uninvited. That boy, he's proof they've been spying, waiting to raid. Nora barked a bitter laugh. You think 50 warriors rode here at dawn just to spy? They came for their child. Nothing more. That's what they want you to think. Grady's voice was all venom. He turned to his men. This is what comes from letting women play savior. She's compromised, siding with savages. At that, Nora's rage could no longer be contained. Without a word, she raised her rifle to the sky and pulled the trigger. The sharp crack exploded through the dawn, echoing off the nearby hills. birds scattered into the air. Every rider, Cheyenne and settler alike, jerked in place. Grady's hand instinctively flew to his holster. "Put your weapons down!" Nora shouted, her voice fierce and unwavering. "Every last one of you. If anyone fires a shot here today, it'll be the end of Sweetwater County as you know it." The wind stirred her coat. Behind her, the Cheyenne remained still. No sudden movements, no provocations. But their readiness was clear. Any threat to the boy or the woman who had protected him would be answered swiftly. Grady's eyes widened. "You've lost your mind, Nora." "No," she said, voice quieter now, but laced with ice. "I've finally found my spine." "You think this is a game? Look around. If they wanted war, it would have come in the night. You'd have never woken up. But they didn't come with blood in their hearts. They came for their child." One of the warriors stepped forward, speaking in halting English. Take boy. We go." His words were simple, but the tone was laden with restraint and sorrow. He gestured gently to Sekitsi, who stood now between Nora and Nesto, his small frame stiff with emotion. Grady spat into the dirt. And what if they come back? What if they bring more? "You're gonna defend them next time, too." "Nora." She stepped toward him, lowering her rifle, but keeping her grip tight. "If they ever do come back, it won't be because they're the threat. It'll be because we were. If you let fear rule you, Jeremiah, you're not protecting anything. You're provoking the very war you pretend to fear." Grady opened his mouth, then hesitated. Behind him, Clarence Hobbs shifted in his saddle. One of the younger men actually looked toward the Cheyenne and visibly swallowed. They were beginning to see the truth, the sheer numbers, the calm posture of the warriors, the utter lack of aggression. There was no war here, unless one was forced. Grady's lip curled, but he muttered something under his breath and turned his horse. "We'll be watching," he growled. "You think you've ended something here, but you've just invited more trouble. And next time there might not be anyone to stop it." He kicked his horse and began to ride off. His men followed most without a word. When they disappeared over the ridge, a silence like prayer settled over the ranch. Nora's hands finally began to shake. She turned slowly toward the Cheyenne. Nesto stepped forward again. His expression was solemn as he looked down at Sekitsi. He knelt, extending a hand toward the boy, who hesitated only a moment before stepping forward. With deliberate gentleness, Nesto rested his palm on the boy's chest, then cupped the side of his face. A quiet murmur passed between them in Cheyenne, something sacred and personal. Nora watched her throat tightening. Then unexpectedly, Sekitsi turned back and threw his arms around her. She dropped to one knee and embraced him tightly. His small voice reached her ear. "Thank you. You saved me." She held on, unwilling to let go too quickly. "You're brave, Sekitsi. Braver than most men I know. Go home now. Be safe." The boy finally pulled back, his eyes shining. He walked slowly to the horse that waited for him, where an older woman, a grandmother perhaps, helped him mount. She nodded once at Nora, her eyes gleaming with gratitude. Nesto approached one last time. "You good woman," he said carefully. "We remember." Nora inclined her head, voice thick with emotion. "Take care of him. He's a special soul." He nodded. Then with a whistle, the line of warriors turned in unison. The sound of hooves rose softly, and one by one they rode eastward into the rising sun. Within moments, the field was empty. The only proof they had been there were the hoof prints in the dew-soaked grass and the memories burned into Nora's heart. She stood on her porch for a long time, after rifle still in hand, watching the horizon. Her land was quiet again, but she knew it would never be the same, and neither would she. In the days following the silent departure of the Cheyenne warriors, the winds over Sweetwater County felt different, heavier, somehow quieter. Life resumed its course, but the undercurrent of something irrevocably changed lingered like dust that wouldn't quite settle. Nora McAllister returned to her daily routine on the ranch, yet nothing felt routine anymore. The chores, mucking the stalls, milking the cow, mending the fence, moved slower. She'd pause often, her gaze drawn toward the horizon, where Sakitsi and his people had vanished. She could still see him if she closed her eyes, his small hands wrapped around hers, the soft way he'd said, "Thank you," with more sincerity than most adults could muster. Kincaid's Crossing, however, had not gone still. Rumors flared up like prairie fires. Nora, it seemed, had become the center of town gossip. Depending on who was speaking, she was either a fearless heroine who'd stood between two warring factions, or a reckless sympathizer who'd endangered the county by harboring savages. At Harriet Osborne's general store, the tone was mixed. "I heard she pulled a rifle on Grady himself," one rancher whispered. "Darn right she did," said another. "And thank God for it. Could have been a massacre." Still others weren't so kind. "A woman living alone's bound to do foolish things," muttered Miss Lydia Brewster over her bolts of calico. "Taking in an Indian boy without telling anyone. It's unnatural. Harriet would have none of it." She slapped down a jar of jam and fixed Lydia with a glare that could flatten corn. "She did what none of you would have had the courage for. And that's the truth." Back at the ranch, Nora kept her head down and her hands busy. The solitude she once relished now felt vast and hollow. The space Sakitsi had filled, whether trailing her through the orchard or curling up by the hearth, was now painfully empty. She found herself calling for him once by accident, as if he were merely behind the barn. She had placed his washed bandage cloth in the drawer of her bedside table, and beneath it the peppermint stick he hadn't finished. It had melted slightly in the heat of August, hardened again, as September cooled. A silent relic of a bond formed in crisis. Marshal Brackett rode out to see her 3 days after the standoff. He arrived alone, with a wary look in his eyes and a stiffness in his voice. "Mind if I step inside?" he asked. Nora poured coffee into 2 tin mugs and handed him one. The silence stretched long before he spoke. "Grady's stirred half the county. Says you endangered civilians. Says you conspired with a hostile tribe." Nora didn't flinch. "He's lying." Brackett nodded slowly. "I know that. The truth's quieter than lies, though. And you don't have friends in high places." She set down her mug. "I didn't take Sakitsi in to make friends. I did it because he was a child. Alone. Hurt. If I had to do it over, I'd do the same again." He looked at her, then really looked, and something softened behind his weathered features. "You did right," he said. "There won't be charges, but Grady's kind doesn't forgive being embarrassed. He'll wait. Watch. If he sees an opening, he'll take it." She nodded once, curt. "Let him come. I've got more than just barbed wire between me and the world now." The next day, a new visitor arrived, a letter carrier on a dapple-grey mule. He handed Nora a sealed envelope marked from Fort Riley. Inside, a brief message from Private James Wheeler, the same cavalryman who had once promised to file a fair report. "Ma'am?" "We received word from scouts that a group of Cheyenne has moved north peacefully. Among them was an elder woman who spoke of a white woman who saved a lost child. I suspect that's you. Thank you for showing a better way. Stay safe. Private James Wheeler." Nora sat on her porch long after reading it, watching the wind stir the tops of the pecan trees. Something in her chest lightened. Tsakitsi had made it. He was with his family, and they remembered her. Still, the loneliness persisted. There was no ignoring the absence he left behind. His small hand in hers. His quiet questions in Cheyenne she couldn't answer. His growing laughter. Harriet visited again one afternoon, bringing fresh preserves and a sack of flour. "You holding up?" she asked, eyeing Nora as they shelled pecans. "I'm all right," Nora said, but her voice didn't carry much conviction. Harriet patted her hand. "You may feel alone, but you're not. That boy knows what you did, and so do the ones who matter." Nora didn't respond, but her eyes glistened as she turned away. Autumn arrived in full. The orchard ripened with color golden and red leaves carpeting the ground like fire. The air grew sharp in the mornings. Prairie Belle's coat thickened in preparation for the coming frost. One morning while hanging laundry, Nora paused at the sound of distant hoof beats. Her heart quickened. Was it trouble? But as the rider crested the hill, she recognized the blue of a cavalry coat. Not Brackett. Not Grady. It was Private Wheeler. He dismounted and tipped his hat. "Ma'am, I was passing through on patrol. Thought I'd bring this in person." He handed her a small pouch made of soft deer hide. Inside was a folded piece of cloth Cheyenne weave. It had once been part of Tsakitsi's blanket. "He asked them to give that to you," Wheeler said. "Said you were family in your own way." Nora brought the cloth to her face, breathing in the faint, familiar scent of prairie smoke and herbs. She didn't speak. She couldn't. "I'll let you be the private," said softly. He mounted up and rode off, leaving her standing among swaying laundry and swirling leaves, the cloth clutched tightly in her hand. That night, she placed the Cheyenne cloth beside the peppermint stick and bandage in her drawer. 3 tokens. 3 memories. Proof of a bond forged in silence, struggle, and love. The West was still wild, still dangerous. But on one ranch in Sweetwater County, peace had taken root not in gunfire or treaties, but in the quiet courage of a woman who chose compassion over fear. In the quiet that followed the tension-filled days, Sweetwater County gradually returned to its normal rhythm. Though for Nora McAllister, nothing felt quite the same. The prairie winds carried fewer rumors, the saloon had quieter nights, and even Jeremiah Grady's bark seemed less sharp now that his bluster had yielded no blood. The image of 50 Cheyenne warriors vanishing into the sunrise had left its mark. No one could quite forget it. Some townsfolk still whispered about it over poker hands and pews, retelling the events with either reverence or resentment depending on their hearts. But without violence to fan the flames, and no retaliation from the Cheyenne, the fire of suspicion slowly burned out. Marshal Brackett visited Nora once more this time, without his deputy. He stood on her porch with his hat in his hand and fatigue around his eyes. "No charges, Nora," he said. "Grady's stirring the pot, but without any proof or gunfire, there's nothing for me to do but tip my hat and walk away. Just stay cautious. Grady may be quiet now, but he don't forget easy." Nora had nodded, thanked him, and sent him off with a jar of pecan preserves. But even after the marshal was gone, she stood at the porch rail for a long time, staring toward the horizon, where ghost memories of horseback silhouettes still haunted the morning mist. Life moved on piece by piece. The orchard bore a solid harvest, and she sold enough pecans in town to keep the roof patched and Prairie Belle well fed. Harriet Osborne, loyal as ever, made more frequent trips out to the ranch. The two women would sit on the porch and sip tea, speaking in gentle tones about anything but the boy, until inevitably silence would settle, and one of them would glance towards the barn as if expecting to see Tsikitsi's small shadow dart by. Nora missed him in ways she couldn't quite explain. She missed the quiet sound of his bare feet on the wooden floor. She missed the way he watched the firelight flicker, as though seeing magic. She even missed the language barrier that had brought them closer through gestures and smiles. Most nights, she found herself holding the boy's bandage cloth, now clean folded and tucked in her bedside drawer. It had once been a practical thing, but now it felt like a keepsake of something sacred. Then came the letter. It arrived in late October, delivered by a traveling mail carrier who stopped by the ranch on his way to Kincaid's Crossing. The envelope bore the seal of Fort Riley and was addressed simply to Miss Eleanora McAllister, Sweetwater County. She opened it with trembling fingers. Inside was a short, handwritten note. "Ma'am, I hope this finds you well. I wanted you to know that a band of Cheyenne families, likely the same who came to your ranch, have been seen moving peacefully north along the Smoky Hill River. An elder woman with them has told the story of a brave white woman who sheltered a lost child. I believe she was speaking of you. Thank you for doing the right thing. Stay safe, Private James Wheeler, 4th Cavalry." Nora read the letter 3 times before she let it fall gently to the table. Then she sat, hands folded in her lap, eyes misted with something too full to name. Tsikitsi was alive. He had found his family. And someone out there was telling her story, not in Sweetwater's narrow streets, but under open skies and beside fire-lit camps where it mattered most. The West, she knew, remained a place of hardship and fear. Yet this one small story, a lost child, found sheltered and returned, was proof that grace could exist even where fences and prejudice carved the land. One act of kindness, one child's safety, one moment of courage. And sometimes she reminded herself that was how peace began. When Nora McAllister first stumbled upon a lost Cheyenne child on her land, she never imagined it would test her courage, her compassion, and her standing in Sweetwater County. Yet in choosing to protect Tsikitsi, she faced down bigotry, risked her livelihood, and defied an entire town's fearful whispers. In the end, her unwavering humanity shone through a single flame burning against the darkness of ignorance. And though the 50 silent warriors vanished at dawn that 7th day, their presence forever changed the lives they touched. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the Wild West, where compassion can eclipse conflict, and a single act of kindness can bridge worlds. If you found yourself enthralled by Nora's bravery and want more stories of frontier courage, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Each act of support helps us keep these remarkable tales alive and shining for the next generation of storytellers. We appreciate you riding along.